The train groaned into Redemption Gulch, Nevada, its hiss of steam a weary sigh against the hammer of the July sun. For 18-year-old Lynn, the sound was the closing of a door on everything she had ever known. She stood on the carriage step, a small figure in a simple gray cheongsam, the high collar a stark, formal line against the raw, sun-bleached wood of the platform. In one hand, she clutched a worn leather valise containing 2 other dresses and a silk pouch of dried herbs from her mother. In the other, she held the leash of the only piece of home she had brought with her. Bao, her family's German shepherd, sat faithfully at her heel, his black and tan coat shimmering with dust, his intelligent eyes scanning the crowd with a quiet alertness that mirrored her own. The faces staring back were a blur of white and unfamiliar. Hard-faced men in sweat-stained hats, women with pinched expressions who pulled their children closer as she descended to the platform. Whispers followed her like flies, words she could not understand but whose meaning was plain in any language. She was an oddity, a porcelain doll dropped in a dust bowl, and the townspeople of Redemption Gulch were not sure whether to be curious or hostile. She searched the crowd for the man from the photograph, a severe-looking man with a square jaw and pale eyes. Her father had arranged it all through a series of letters, a practical transaction that secured her future and forged an alliance for his trading business back in San Francisco. She was to be the wife of Jasper Croft, a homesteader with 160 acres of land and a reputation that the letters had conveniently omitted. A man separated himself from the shadows of the station overhang. He was taller than the photograph suggested and leaner. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of a life lived outdoors under an unforgiving sky. He wore a gun belt, the leather dark and oiled, the pistol handle worn smooth from use. It was the first thing she noticed, a piece of him that screamed of violence and finality. This was Jasper Croft. He did not smile. He simply watched her approach, his gaze taking in the silk dress, the small valise, and finally the large dog at her side. Lynn's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been warned there would be rules, customs she did not understand. A dog, especially one this large, might be seen as a burden, a useless mouth to feed. She tightened her grip on the leash, ready to defend the last vestige of her old life. Jasper stopped a few feet from her. The townsfolk fell silent, waiting. He looked from her face to the dog, then back again. His expression was unreadable, a mask carved from prairie granite. Bao, sensing her fear, emitted a low, almost inaudible growl, the sound a deep vibration against her leg. Jasper's eyes settled on the dog. He took in the animal's powerful chest, its steady posture, the alert intelligence in its gaze. A long moment passed. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something that loosened the rigid set of his jaw. "Good," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough like burlap. "I need a herding partner." The words hung in the hot, still air, so contrary to the hostility she had expected that for a moment Lynn did not understand. He wasn't angry. He wasn't dismissing her companion. He was assessing him, valuing him. He gestured with his chin toward a buckboard wagon waiting at the end of the street. "Come on," he said. "It's a long ride home." Without another word, he took her valise and turned, expecting her to follow. As Lynn walked behind him, Bao trotting calmly at her side, the whispers of the town resumed, but they seemed to her a little more distant now, a little less important than the quiet, practical acceptance of the man who was now her husband. The homestead was even more isolated than she had imagined. It was a small, clapboard cabin set in a shallow valley, surrounded by miles of sagebrush and rock. A crude corral held a small flock of sheep, their woolly coats gray with dust. The place felt temporary, as if it were clinging to the land by a thread. There was a stark, lonely beauty to it, but it was a beauty that promised hardship. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room held a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove. Jasper had made an effort. There was a new quilt on the bed and a tin of tea on the shelf, a small gesture of welcome that felt enormous in the silence. The first days passed in a haze of awkward adjustments. Lynn spoke almost no English, and Jasper was a man of few words in any language. They communicated through gestures and necessity. He showed her how to work the water pump, how to bank the stove at night. She cooked for him, her unfamiliar dishes filling the small cabin with the scent of ginger and star anise, flavors as foreign to that valley as she was. He ate everything she put in front of him without comment, his quiet gratitude a language of its own. All the while, Bal was her shadow, a constant, reassuring presence. Jasper watched the dog, his interest professional. He saw how Bal moved, the way he anticipated Lynn's needs, the discipline in his stillness. He had a small flock, his primary asset, but he was one man against a vast and dangerous landscape. Coyotes were a constant threat, their yipping calls a nightly chorus from the surrounding hills. A herding partner wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity he couldn't afford to hire. The first real test came a week after her arrival. They were in town for supplies, the buckboard loaded with flour, salt, and coffee. The air in Redemption Gulch was thick with a tension that seemed to center on them. As Jasper was tying the reins to the hitching post outside the general store, a man stepped off the boardwalk to block their path. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his face clean-shaven and florid. He was the kind of man whose softness was a sign of power, not weakness. "Mr. Croft," the man said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Good to see you in town." Jasper's body went still. "Finch," he acknowledged, his tone flat. Bartholomew Finch's eyes slid past Jasper to Lynn, his gaze lingering with an appraising quality that made her skin crawl. He gave a small, condescending smile. "I see you've acquired some new company, and a fine-looking animal." His eyes flicked to Bal, who had moved to stand slightly in front of Lynn, his posture subtly protective. "She's my wife," Jasper said, the words a clear boundary. "The dog helps with the flock." "Of course," Finch said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "A man needs all the help he can get out on these marginal claims. It takes a great deal of improvement to satisfy the terms of the Homestead Act. Fencing, irrigation, a proper dwelling. The Territorial Land Office is very particular about such things." He let the words hang in the air, a polite and venomous threat. Everyone in town knew Finch owned the largest cattle ranch in the county, and that he had an insatiable appetite for more land. He considered Jasper's small sheep operation an unsightly blemish on his empire. "My claim is sound," Jasper said, his hand moving to rest near the butt of his pistol, a gesture so natural it was almost unconscious. Finch's smile widened. "I certainly hope so. It would be a shame for your family to be displaced." He tipped his hat to Lynn, a gesture of mock courtesy, and continued down the boardwalk, the owner of the town taking his constitutional. The encounter left a chill in the air. The other townsfolk who had been watching from a distance now avoided their eyes. They were Jasper and Lynn against the world, and the world was owned by Bartholomew Finch. On the ride back to the homestead, the silence in the wagon was heavier than usual. Jasper's jaw was set like stone. Lynn understood now that their home was not a sanctuary but a battleground, and the first shot had just been fired. She looked out at the endless expanse of dry land, land that Finch called marginal, and felt a surge of protectiveness for the small cabin and the quiet man beside her. This was her life now. She would not let it be taken without a fight. What Finch didn't know was that she and Bal were more than just company. They were partners, and they knew a thing or two about protecting their flock. The threat from Finch was a low hum beneath the surface of their days, but the land itself presented a more immediate danger. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, a frantic bleating erupted from the corral. Jasper grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant. Lynn was right behind him, a lantern in her hand. In the flickering light, they saw the source of the panic. 2 coyotes, lean and ghostly in the dimness, were circling the flock, trying to separate a young lamb from its mother. Jasper raised his rifle, but the animals were quick, darting between the panicked sheep. A shot was as likely to hit one of his own animals as it was a predator. The sheep were bunched against the far fence, trampling each other in their terror. It was chaos. Before Jasper could decide on a course of action, Lynn spoke a sharp, low command in Mandarin. Bao, who had been standing at her side, a coiled spring of restrained energy, shot forward. He didn't bark. He didn't charge wildly. He moved with a fluid, calculated grace. He circled the flock, not at the coyotes, but at the sheep, his movements pushing them back, tightening the herd into a defensive knot. He put himself between the flock and the predators, his body low to the ground, teeth bared in a silent snarl. The coyotes, faced with this disciplined, fearless guardian instead of a scattering of prey, hesitated. They were used to panic, not organized resistance. One of them fainted, testing the dog's resolve. Bao didn't flinch. He held his ground, a silent, unbreachable wall. The moment of opportunity was lost. With a final, frustrated yip, the coyotes melted back into the shadows of the hills. The corral fell silent, save for the nervous stamping of the sheep. Bao remained in his guarding posture until Lynn gave another quiet command. He trotted back to her side, his duty done. Jasper slowly lowered his rifle. He looked at the calm flock, at the spot where the coyotes had vanished, and then at Lynn and her dog. He had seen sheepdogs before, scrappy, yapping things. He had never seen anything like this. The animal's silence, its intelligence, its perfect obedience to a woman who spoke in a language he couldn't understand. It was a revelation. He had sent for a wife, a companion to ease the crushing loneliness of the frontier. He had gotten a partner with an ally more effective than his own gun. He looked at Lynn, her small frame illuminated by the lantern light, her expression calm and steady. In that moment, his respect for her deepened into something more profound. She wasn't a fragile doll to be protected. She was a survivor, and she had brought her own form of power to his desperate piece of land. But as he secured the corral gate, a cold thought settled in his gut. Predators like coyotes were a part of this life. Predators like Finch were another matter entirely. He wondered which would prove more dangerous in the end. A few nights later he got his answer. He rose before dawn to check the flock, and found one of his fence lines near the creek cut clean through. A single ewe, one of his best, was gone. There were no coyote tracks, only the hoof prints of a single horse, ridden by a man who knew what he was doing. It wasn't a random act. It was a message. That night, the silence in the cabin was a living thing, thick with unspoken tension. Jasper sat at the small table, methodically cleaning his rifle, the metallic scrape and click of the mechanism the only sound. Lynn sat on the edge of the bed, mending a tear in one of his shirts, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic precision. Bao lay on the floor between them, his head on his paws, but his eyes were open, tracking Jasper's movements. The cut fence and the stolen ewe had changed everything. The threat was no longer a matter of polite words in town. It had come to their doorstep. Jasper finally broke the silence, his voice low. "He's trying to push us out." He didn't need to say Finch's name. "He'll say I can't protect my stock, that I'm not properly working the land. He'll use it with the land office." Lynn looked up from her sewing, her dark eyes meeting his. She understood more English than she could speak, piecing together meaning from tone and context. She saw the worry etched around his eyes, the grim set of his jaw. This man, who seemed so self-reliant and strong, was afraid of losing the one thing he had. He laid the rifle parts on an oiled cloth. "I shouldn't have brought you into this," he said, the words heavy with a guilt he couldn't hide. "I sent for a wife because this place is quiet. Too quiet. I spent years after the war moving from one place to the next. I was tired of it. I wanted to build something that would last." He looked around the small, bare cabin. "It isn't much, but it's mine." It was the most he had ever said about himself. The admission of loneliness, of a desire for peace, cracked open the stoic exterior he presented to the world. It was a moment of profound vulnerability. Lynn set her sewing aside. She stood up and went to her small valise, retrieving the silk pouch her mother had given her. It was a simple, faded thing, embroidered with a single crane. She brought it back to the table and held it out to him. "For peace," she said, one of the few English words she knew well. She opened the pouch, releasing the faint, calming scent of dried jasmine and chamomile. She tipped a few of the dried petals into her palm, and then gestured from the herbs to his heart. "My mother gave me, for new home." He looked at the fragile petals in her hand, then at her face. He understood. She was not blaming him. She was offering comfort, sharing the only charm she had against the fear and uncertainty of this new life. She was telling him they were in this together. He reached out, not to take the herbs, but to gently close her hand over them, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers for just a moment. It was the first time they had touched. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't name. The fragile peace of that moment was shattered less than a week later. A man on horseback rode into their valley, not with the swagger of a cowboy, but with the officious air of a man from the government. He introduced himself as an agent from the Territorial Land Office and handed Jasper a folded document. It was a formal notice of a counterclaim filed by Bartholomew Finch. The document cited an obscure survey from 2 decades prior, claiming that the creek running through Jasper's land, his only reliable water source, actually marked the boundary of Finch's property. Furthermore, Finch alleged that Jasper had failed to make the necessary improvements to the land as stipulated by the Homestead Act, making his claim invalid. The agent, a man with tired, bureaucratic eyes, informed Jasper he had 30 days to present a formal, legal response and prove the validity of his claim. If he failed, the land and all its improvements would revert to the territory, to be auctioned to the most suitable bidder, who would undoubtedly be Finch. The agent tipped his hat and rode away, leaving the official paper in Jasper's hand like a death sentence. 30 days. To fight a legal battle against a man like Finch, he needed a lawyer from Carson City. He needed money for filing fees, for a new survey. He needed cash, and he had none. His only asset was his flock of sheep. Selling them would mean giving up the very livelihood the land was supposed to provide. He would be saving the empty ground by sacrificing the means to live on it. He stood there staring at the paper, the sun beating down on him, feeling the trap close around him. He could sell the flock and maybe, just maybe, win the legal fight, only to be left with nothing to restock his empty corrals. Or he could keep the flock, try to ride it out, and be evicted in a month, losing everything. It was an impossible choice. He walked back to the cabin, the weight of defeat settling on his shoulders. He explained the situation to Lynn as best he could, the legal words clumsy on his tongue. He expected to see fear in her eyes, or perhaps accusation. Instead, he saw a quiet determination. She listened intently, her gaze fixed on his face. When he was finished, she didn't speak for a long time. She walked to the cabin door and looked out at the small flock grazing near the creek. She looked at Bow, who sat watching her, waiting for a command. Then she turned back to Jasper. She pointed a finger at Bow, then swept her hand in a gesture that encompassed the sheep and the vast, dry hills beyond their valley. "We work," she said, her voice clear and firm. She then added another word, one he had taught her. "More." He didn't understand. She tried again, using a combination of gestures and the few words she had. She pointed to the sheep, then made a motion of them growing fat. She pointed to Bow. "Good partner," she said. Then she pointed to the distant hills, to the marginal grazing land that other ranchers ignored because it was too difficult to manage a flock there. She was proposing a gamble, not of money, but of labor. Instead of selling the flock, they would use Bow's incredible skill to work it harder, move it faster, and fatten the lambs on forage others couldn't reach. They would create the profit they needed instead of liquidating their assets. It was a desperate, back-breaking plan, but it was a plan of action, not surrender. He looked at her, this young woman from a world away, who had every right to feel terrified and helpless. And in her eyes he saw not fear, but a flinty resolve that matched his own. She was not just his wife. She was his partner in the truest sense of the word. In that moment, he made his choice. He would not sell. He would not run. He would trust her. "All right," he said, a sense of purpose returning to him for the first time since the agent had arrived. "We work." The next 3 months were a blur of relentless effort. They were up before the sun and worked long after it had set. Jasper rode for miles, mending fences and digging a new irrigation ditch from the creek, a visible, undeniable improvement to the land. But the heart of their operation was Lynn and Bow. Every morning she would take the flock out, pushing them not onto the sparse grass of their small valley, but up into the rocky, brush-covered hills. It was grueling work. The terrain was treacherous, and the flock was constantly spooked by snakes and the scent of predators. But Bow was magnificent. He moved like a shadow, anticipating the flock's movements, guiding them with a nudge here, a sharp stare there. He responded to Lynn's quiet, whistled commands, a language that floated on the wind between them. He could hold the entire flock on a steep, rocky slope while they grazed on tough, resilient grasses no one else bothered with. The townspeople, riding the main trail, would sometimes see them, the small woman in practical trousers Jasper had bought for her, and her silent, tireless dog, managing a flock in a place no man would have tried to. The sight became a quiet legend in Redemption Gulch. The whispers about the strange Chinese bride were replaced by murmurs of grudging admiration. Slowly their gamble began to pay off. The sheep, feeding on the rich forage, grew fatter and healthier. They lost not a single lamb to coyotes or accident. By the end of the 2nd month, they had a surplus of wool and several lambs ready for market. Jasper took the wagon to a town 2 days south, avoiding Finch's influence in Redemption Gulch, and got a fair price. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to hire a traveling circuit lawyer he'd heard of, a sharp, honest man who disliked land barons on principle. The lawyer came, reviewed Finch's claim, and saw it for what it was, a legal fiction built on a fraudulent survey map. He filed Jasper's response with the land office, complete with sworn affidavits from older settlers in the region who remembered the original boundaries, and a detailed log of the improvements Jasper and Lynn had made in the last 90 days. The day the territorial agent was due to return felt like a judgment. Jasper and Lynn waited by the cabin, watching the road. When he finally appeared, he was not alone. Bartholomew Finch rode beside him, a look of smug certainty on his face. The agent dismounted and approached them, his expression neutral. "Mr. Croft? Mrs. Croft?" He nodded to each of them. "We have reviewed your response and Mr. Finch's counterclaim." Finch smirked. "I believe you'll find everything in order, Agent. The man's a squatter." The agent ignored him, his gaze fixed on Jasper. "The land office is found in your favor, Mr. Croft. Your claim is sound. The improvements are substantial and well documented." He then turned to Finch, his voice hardening. "Furthermore, the survey map you submitted has been found to be a forgery. The territorial marshal will be paying you a visit to discuss the matter of filing a fraudulent claim." Finch's face went from florid to pale. The smirk vanished, replaced by a stunned, sputtering outrage. He looked from the agent to Jasper, and then to Lynn, who stood quietly with Bow at her side. He saw not a frightened squatter and his foreign bride, but two determined partners who had outmaneuvered him, not with guns, but with hard work and a clever dog. Without another word, he wrenched his horse around and galloped away, his public humiliation complete. The agent tipped his hat. "The land is yours. Good day." As he rode off, a profound quiet settled over the valley. It was the quiet of victory, of a peace that had been earned. Jasper looked at the land, the hills, the creek, the small cabin, and for the first time it felt truly and securely his. He turned to Lynn, who was watching him, a small, tentative smile on her face. He didn't have the words to express the gratitude and admiration that filled his chest. Instead, he walked over to her. He didn't embrace her or even take her hand. He simply reached out and gently touched the small silk pouch she now wore on a cord around her neck. It was worn and softened from daily wear. "Your mother was right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It brought peace." Lynn's smile widened. She looked up at him, then out at the flock grazing peacefully in the late afternoon sun, with Bow watching over them, their silent guardian. "Our home," she said, the words clear and certain. Together they stood and watched the sun set over the land they had fought for and won. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.